We are moving closer to the general elections in 2024, and this time around, independent candidates will be allowed to stand. There'll also be new political parties, and among them are Build One South Africa, led by former DA leader Mmusi Maimane, and Rise Mzansi, led by Songezo Zibi. Now, we might see more new names as we get closer to the elections as well, and some people are saying that this vote will be like the groundbreaking 1994 elections. Do you agree with that? But what can we expect from next year's elections? Let's have a chat with a political analyst, Lukhona Mnguni. A very good morning to you, Lukhona. What are your sentiments? I mean, some are saying that next year's elections are going to be perhaps just as groundbreaking on different levels as the 1994 elections. Do you agree with that sentiment?
A very good morning, Tammy, and of course to the dear viewers of eNCA. Look, every election is often touted as, the most significant election than the previous ones. And that's simply because you'd expect certain shifts in the political landscape as the democracy, matures. I mean, you can go back as far as, 1999, where you saw the formation of the UDM in 1996, and therefore it contested the ANC quite significantly, especially in parts of the Eastern Cape and some pockets of KwaZulu-Natal. And of course, one of the things that make an election watershed is how much it shifts the ground politically and hopefully for the betterment of citizens. And I think you go to the 2009 moment, which sees the most successful launch of a new political party in South Africa in the Congress of the People, which became, an official opposition in 5 provincial legislatures, and it gained 30 seats in the National Assembly. Then you go to the formation of the EFF and so on. And I think what is compelling about 2024 is the fact that the South African democracy turns 30 years. And it's a good moment to evaluate whether or not over 3 decades, because that's almost a generation. So if you think about it, a child who was born in 1994 should have gone through the schooling system, the post-schooling system, and is probably expected to be some indicator of what has this democracy given to the ordinary people in South Africa. Of course, there are other issues that we are looking out for from a politics point of view, and that is the possible loss of power by the African National Congress for the first time in the Gauteng province, which is the economic hub of the country, and possibly in KwaZulu-Natal. But KwaZulu-Natal would not be as surprising because the ANC was not the natural strongest political party in that province. The IFP was, and they displaced the IFP over time. So indeed, 2024 is going to be an interesting election year, and partly, as you are mentioning, a lot more players offering their vision for South Africa, their type of leadership that they want to endow the country with, and therefore we should look at it as.
And perhaps, Lukhona, let's look at these new players who are going to be contesting the elections. The electoral amendment bill has now been signed, into law. Yes, we've had other political parties arising in previous elections, but this is a very different landscape. We also have individuals who are not necessarily career politicians, the likes of Songezo Zibi, for example, coming to the fold and saying, I want to be the one to lead South Africa. What is this saying about South Africans and perhaps our allegiance to the traditional political parties that were actually the freedom fighters that have brought us to this point?
Quite correct, Tammy. The Electoral Amendment Act, despite the number of challenges that have been placed before the Constitutional Court, first of all, as you had said to Gareth, paves way for independent candidates to stand, and people indeed, including the likes of Zaki Ahmed, who are not necessarily career politicians in the way we understand a politician, but they've been doing political work all their lives. trying to force the state to provide certain services to people, services that people are constitutionally entitled to. And the government would have been, lethargic in some instances in providing those services. But what it tells us, Tammy, is that South Africa is such at a crisis point, and it creates what I call political panic. And now political panic is both good and bad. It's good in the sense that it can motivate individuals, as you mentioned, like Songezo Zibi, who have spent their entire lives in corporate South Africa, to then, find this agitation in them because they've been observing the political landscape, writing about it, and so on, to then raise their hands and say, well, in this moment in my life and in the life of my country, I'm unable to just sit this one out. I've got to raise my hand and get into the ring and really wrestle the political power and hopefully redirect it in meaningful ways towards service of the country, because the country has just gone so adrift from the center that is defined, first of all, in our constitution, the center that is defined in our values that are enshrined in the constitution, and of course the legislation that flows from it. The bad part about political panic is that it could create a multiplicity of such people to an extent that it actually clogs the political landscape and fatigues the voter. That now, why suddenly all of you now want to be involved in politics, and makes the choices available to voters much more blurry than obvious. And that is the potential risk of a political crisis such as the one we have in South Africa. And then in that instance where there's a stampede, I mean, you said to Gareth there would be a buffet of political choices for people. But unfortunately, if you've been to a buffet, Tammy, there are instances you walk around and by the time you're done with the walkabout, your appetite has been lost and you actually don't feel like eating anything, and you ask for the a la carte menu, which is what you are used to. So it's a tough period for South Africa, whilst the emergence of new political players and actually the emergence of non-politicians in the political landscape is quite exciting, and willing to see how South Africans receive these non-politicians as political actors who want to gain political power and, of course, by defect of that, become politicians. But whether or not the appetite of South Africans will not be further switched off because there's just too much on the menu.
Lukhona, you bring up such a really good point there. The potential for this backfiring, quote unquote, because if these political players or these presidential candidates are coming to, quote unquote, unseat the African National Congress because they believe they have better solutions for the country, this could in some ways also let the voters just revert back to what they know, because it's tried, it's tested, especially if you don't know how you are going to vote and who you are going to choose. What are the challenges you believe that these candidates have in differentiating themselves, in making themselves stand out to the voter?
There are a number of things, Tammy. In actual fact, the African National Congress has been the center of gravity of South African politics. In actual fact, I often say that even the current political parties that you have, you can trace quite a number of them to the ANC, whether in terms of breakaways, the PAC, the IFP, the UDM, the EFF, the Congress of the People, and quite a few smaller others. I mean, that would have spawned off those political parties, the NFP from the IFP and so on. And so the ANC has been the center of gravity, and therefore the only differentiating issue for most people has been around personalities, in terms of, do I like this person better than the people that are still left inside the ANC and so on. So I think the first challenge that new political parties are going to face is going to be around messaging. Now, the tendency is always to want to be extremely outside of the ANC in how you message. Unfortunately, South Africans are politically and I think socially to an extent conservative. And the ANC has defined the sort of parameters of the playing field of those conservative politics in South Africa. And therefore, whilst wanting to be different and differentiate themselves, in actual fact, I would argue that partly what will make some of these new political parties resonate with voters is in actual fact to appeal to some ANC voters who have lost faith in the ANC, have probably not voted for the ANC for the last 2 elections, but they actually feel betraying the South African democratic mission by not being able to vote and not being able to find that alternative. The question becomes, how do you actually set yourself up as an alternative to the ANC rather than as an opposition to the ANC, as an alternative choice, a choice that resonates with the center of gravity of South African politics, but a choice that also puts across compelling leaders in the collective of leaders who, when South Africans look at them, believe and trust that these leaders can take the country forward. And I think, again, exactly on what you have said, Tammy, and I was watching Mmusi Maimane's Build One South Africa launching a presidential candidate of Mmusi Maimane. Unfortunately, South African politics are not about presidential candidates. That's already a misfire for me where I am seated. You need to present a political party rather than a savior in the individual, and those will become very important as we edge closer, because remember, in South Africa, the president is elected at the first sitting of the National Assembly, and therefore you run as a political party, not as a presidential candidate, not at least in the South African context. And I think some of those things, if people are not careful, those things put off voters, because they say, oh, you already even know which seat you want, you already even know what type of power that you want, rather than giving us a compelling vision for society. This is actually about you. Must we promote you as a self? Until we get to a presidential election system, that does not necessarily, for me, resonate well with voters. And therefore, the messaging is going to be critical. The genuinity in the approach of the politics is going to be important. But, of course, undoing some of the things that the ANC has done, such as taking voters for granted.
Lukhona, you mentioned two aspects here, and I wonder which strategy would be most expedient for the newcomers, so to speak. Do they target the traditionally ANC voter who's now despondent and is therefore no longer voting, or should they rather focus on an entirely new constituent that has not been voting, perhaps the younger demographic that has no interest in politics because of when they were born and what they have experienced? What would you propose to be a more fruitful strategy forward?
I mean, the younger voter, it's not only a question of when they were born. It's also a question of the type of politics that they actually expect. So if you go to spaces where young people organize in their communities, on campuses, those who are fortunate to be in universities, and you see the shift that has happened over the last 30 years in how young people organize themselves, and how young people, Tammy, have been able to organize themselves in communities and decoupled themselves from the mainstream political parties. And so they no longer need politics and political parties, let me not say politics, political parties to organize themselves. Their politics are different. They want to be taken seriously. I've done a lot of work in the last 15 months, just, in focus groups with different young people, visiting different communities. And so their politics is different. Secondly, their politics does not necessarily hitch its success on electoral politics. And therefore, whilst it is noble to say people must spend money trying to get young people to vote, unfortunately, young people are just generally not registered. Young people start being registered from about the ages of 25, Tammy. And that's because, in my hypothesis from the research that I've been doing now over the years, is that as a young person at 25, you've interacted enough with the state. So at 18, when you leave school, generally, you would have interacted with the state, with your matric education and so on. And maybe you feel, okay, I haven't had the chance to get ahead as a person. I haven't get a chance to get employment. But once you are 25, you start realizing time is against me and opportunities are not coming. If you're a taxpayer, you feel that you are overly taxed and the returns are not there in terms of the public goods and services that you receive from the state. And therefore, you start seeing higher participation rates from about 25 onwards. So now, from a political point of view, with limited resources, where would you rather go? You probably rather go to people who are most likely on the voters' roll, rather than going to people who are not on the voters' roll. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. And the fertile ground are those people who still probably are of a middle age and feel that they have a role to play in advancing and protecting this democracy through the vote, but they do not know who to vote for. What language do you find to communicate and interact with those people?
We'll leave it at that for this morning, Lukhona. Thank you so much for your insight. That's political analyst Lukhona Mnguni. Certainly a long road ahead as far as the 2024 elections are concerned. And how do you attract the voter? How do you best position yourself? And I wonder, with the current political landscape and with the new entrants, Are there possible candidates that the 25-year-olds, the early 30-year-olds would actually be gravitating towards? We'll see as we get closer to next year.